You're very welcome to our first Saturday morning session where we're going to be examining a seismic shift with a question mark in Irish politics and looking at that trend. So I'm very, very excited this morning because I feel like I'm hosting the Brendan O'Connor show. So it's been a real living a dream for me. We're being joined today by Theresa Reidy from UCD, from Gary Murphy from DCU, and from Aidan Regan from UCD also, to discuss that question. Is there being a seismic shift? Is this something that's probably going to be staying with us, or is it a flash in the pan if it exists at all? So I suppose the first question, and we'll start off with yourself, Gary, as one of our biggest fans in the Social Democrats. A seismic shift. Has there been a seismic shift? Or is that just hubris on our part?
No, not at all. Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be back in Cork. My Cork accent will get a bit stronger, and certainly was a bit stronger in the bar last night as I was refuting allegations from not one, not two, but three people of why do you hate the Social Democrats?
We'll get to that.
And I'm always happy for a challenge, and of course I don't. And I think one of the big seismic shifts over the course of the last 15 years. I mean, there has been a seismic shift in 15 years because of the demise of Fianna Fáil. That's the first thing to say. You had a tremendous consistency in this state from the 1932 election to 2011, where Fianna Fáil would get, I think they dropped below 40 twice, but they'd get 39 to 45% of the vote, and then they got 17% of the vote that day. So that's and ever since then we've had this extraordinary volatility. But in terms of, this morning and the audience, a big shift, I think, has been the emergence of the Social Democrats, because if you had asked me in 2015 and the emergence of two new parties, the Social Democrats, let's be fair, formed out of a schism with Labour to a certain extent, with policy differences, and Renua, do you remember them? People might have said, well, yeah, there is a space on the centre-right, and there's a space on the centre-right for a party that is pro-life, so-called, or anti-choice, whichever phrase one wants to use, sceptical of the size of the state, in favour of tax cuts, in favour of lower public spending perhaps, the old PDs really, and there was a space for them, as we know, and that just hasn't happened, and the space has been on the, now my two eminent colleagues will talk a bit more sophisticatedly than I will, I'm sure, because they'll know more about the sort of electoral shifts and changes in voting patterns and the like. But the Irish voter is going left, and I, for one, was surprised that there was a space in the centre-left, the progressive centre-left, for a party like the Social Democrats. And I think that has been a seismic shift, because if you said in 10 years' time, where were the Social Democrats? So let's fast forward to 2036. Well, one of the things I would say, it should be in government in some shape or form, and I think one of my criticisms over the past few years, whether I've written about it or mentioned it on RT or whatever, is, in my view, a reluctance, a strong reluctance to go into government. Now, I'm long enough watching politics to understand what happened to Labour in 2016 when they went from 37 seats to 7 seats and barely survived, and are on a bit of life support ever since. And I'm even longer around to know what happened to the Greens in both 2011 and in 2024. I hired Roger O'Gorman, by the way, as a lecturer in EU law, and I thought I'd be bringing him back last November, 12 months. But, he struggled on in Dublin West, so the only one. So I understand the issues around smaller parties going into coalition. But from my perspective, if there is to be a seismic shift going forward and the Social Democrats are to be involved in it, you have to be in government in some shape or form. I know the dangers of coalition government. I know the dangers of going in with, the heathens in Fine Gael, the centre-right, anything to do with the sort of the right. But then I look at the Mercosur deal a few weeks ago, which I think would have clearly passed if it was a Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, if they had a majority of one or two. And the regional independents just said, no, we're not having it. And, the government buckled down. So I think you can get things done in government. The Greens got things done, the Progressive Democrats got things done, but of course they're now both gone. And so that's been one of the big shifts for me, Gary. Yeah,
thank you, Gary. Theresa, for yourself, have you seen a seismic shift?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the best way of thinking about it is in relation to government formation. And so if you think about government formation 30 years ago, it was a fairly simple choice. You had two blocks, Fianna Fáil on one side and Fine Gael on the other side. And one or the other was going to govern. And so you had different small parties over the years, and it was a question of which one would pivot to form the government. That arithmetic just doesn't happen anymore. You now have about 5 equal-sized blocks. Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are much smaller than they used to be. They're now vying in that kind of medium-sized space with Sinn Féin, so the 3 of them are about the same size. And then you have these 2 other blocks that are, broadly speaking, the same size as well. One is the soft left block, in which yourselves are located, but that space is also shared with the Labour Party and with the Greens. And the bloc itself hasn't grown an awful lot in size, but it, at different stages, primacy within that bloc has shifted from among the different components. And then you have a 5th bloc, and the 5th bloc is a very diverse and varied group of primarily independents, but smaller parties now as well, ethno-nationalists. You have Aontú in there, you have Independent Ireland, and the composition of that bloc really is very fluid and it moves around. And the reality of government formation is you need at least 2.5 and preferably 3 of those blocks to form a stable government. So this time around, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael were able to do it with part of that kind of fifth block. So, you know, the certainties of old are gone, and that kind of fluidity that we see in the system is pretty much here to stay. And there's loads of evidence for that. So the most volatile election we had was the 2011 one, and that's because, of course, the collapse in Fianna Fáil and more people changed who they voted for at that election than at any other election that we have data on in Ireland, and it was actually one of the most volatile in Europe. But 2016 was also very volatile, but actually it's been stabilising since, and we're back to the kind of normal patterns of the 80s and 90s. So in many respects we've landed in this new disposition, but the new disposition is a much more fragmented landscape than what the old one was. And so there's a lot more uncertainty about who can form governments. And I suppose the big question for parties in the kind of centre-left space is, you know, who might you coalesce with to go into government? And right now, the kind of landscape looks like there isn't one other partner that can get you there. So the soft left and Sinn Féin can't make it into government on their own unless they either grow the size of their blocks or are willing to coalesce with somebody outside of that. And so you have these kind of 5 moving parts, none of which fit together particularly well, perhaps beyond Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael.
Mm-hmm. And Aidan, could I challenge my own question mark in the sense of a seismic shift? I don't fully believe a seismic shift can be possibly said to have happened, but we still have the same 2 parties in government who've been in there since the foundation of the state. So what would actually a seismic shift actually look like, if I am questioning my own question mark? And where's the space of the Social Democrats within that?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think, you know, a seismic shift would mean that you didn't have Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael in government, right? And that's not the case, obviously. So I wouldn't call it a seismic shift. I mean, to use the kind of formal political science term, we've seen a structural realignment over time. So yes, if you take a 10, 20, 30, 40-year time period, there's obviously been a massive decline in Fianna Fáil in particular, as Gary said. And it's the rise of Sinn Féin that is distinctive, I think, relative to the fall of Fianna Fáil. So then the question is, if you have Ireland looks a bit more like most northwestern European countries now, in that it's a multi-party system. No one party can govern alone, and arguably into the future, no 2 parties can govern alone. So the fact that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael together struggle to form a government, that's obviously a big change. But the question facing the Social Democrats as a party that's what, on average between 8, 9, some polls 10%, but let's say 8%, right? Like, to grow beyond 8%, who do you take the vote from? And then that question feeds into who would you potentially build a coalition government with? So we know very clearly from the data, and I was looking at the National Electoral Survey this morning, the Social Democrats are, if I can put it, a classically centre-left party in Western Europe. Young, urban, liberal, university educated. That's the base, right? So do you want to expand out that type of base? And if you do you take it from Fine Gael? Do you take it from Labour? Do you take it from the Greens? So the Soc Dems, Labour, Greens, to a certain extent people before profit, and parts of Fine Gael are competing for the same vote. So that's the issue, really. So then if you were to build a coalition or a left government, let's say, with Sinn Féin, you couldn't be taking Sinn Féin's vote because then they would decline, right? So I would say that is more of an opportunity for the Social Democrats to sort of say to Sinn Féin, look, your working class base is your base, right? You are left leaning. We have to, we're you know, if we compete,
Jesslyn, calm down.
if we compete with you, you know, for that base, then we're going to end up splitting the vote between us. Now that could be a potential strategy, but it seems to me that it would make more sense for the Social Democrats to solidify themselves as the progressive centre-left party and take up all the other centre-left progressive votes that surround them. And that probably does mean taking in votes from more urban Fine Gael liberal voters as well. That's an opportunity, I think. So I wouldn't call it a seismic shift. There has been a structural realignment of Irish politics. We still have Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael in government, and they have been since the foundation of the state. Until that is not the case, I would say until then it's not a seismic shift.
I would say there has been a complete seismic shift, simply because if we were here in 1989, we'd have been talking about Fianna Fáil never going to coalition with anybody else as a great core value. And that's not that long ago. I mean, I was in UCC at the time, so maybe it is a long time ago. But on Sinn Féin and the Social Democrats taking votes from wherever, like my view on this would be a bit more ruthless, I think, than my esteemed colleagues, which would be you get votes from wherever you can and you worry about, the Shinners can worry about themselves and Fine Gael can worry about themselves. I mean, you need to be putting forward a platform that says, vote for us, number one. I mean, your chances in Dublin Central in the by-election, you got to get a good first preference vote. That's the key. Everyone knows this. You talk about transfers, you know, and I've been on enough RT panels, as my colleagues will know, there at the end to say, oh, when you're stuck, say, oh, it'll all come down to transfers. If you're stuck for anything to say, and then I look plaintively at Theresa to say, help me out here. But you need a good first preference vote. So Aidan talks about 8, 9, 10%, and I think the latest poll is about, whatever, 10.6. That vote, in my view, if you can go from 0 to 10 in 10 years, where the Social Democrats didn't even exist, where could you go in the next 10 years? Yeah, maybe you'll have to differentiate yourself and define yourself a little bit more sharper than some of your other rivals, but ultimately they're your rivals, they're not your mates. Maybe they'll become your mates when you ultimately do a programme for government, but as of now, no, I'm afraid I think politics is a bit more ruthless.
Theresa, do you think younger voters have changed now, or do you think the impacts of issues like, so we always talk about the Social Democrats that are very appealing to younger voters and younger style of voters. Is that different to who the younger voters were in the 80s, the 90s? Would these younger voters still be looking for something new, something a little more energetic, something different from the norm, or is there just more options available now?
It's a bit of both. I mean, the first thing is that younger voters are different now because they don't inherit the political preferences of previous generations in the same way that they would have done through much of the 20th century. So the stability of politics and party systems through the 20th century came in part from the fact that many people inherited the political preferences of their parents. And so that's why you got, roughly speaking, the same vote for parties across much of that period. That doesn't happen in the same numbers anymore. You don't have the same kind of discussion about Fianna Fáil families and Fine Gael families and inherited political preferences. Yeah. And so straight away you have a lot more voters available for smaller political parties to compete for. The second thing is that there's a lot more choice, but these two things, this is a chicken and egg discussion as well. They're directly connected to each other. So the younger voters coming into the system now, they're not partisan, they don't have preferences, and they're more available to be competed for. Voters are different as well. I mean, this is not a feature of Irish politics alone. This is called partisan de-alignment, and it's a feature of advanced industrial democracies all over the world. And so you have a lot more voters available. But there's also, you know, if you dig into that, voters aren't as likely to be loyal to political parties as they once were. And so this is really the challenge for a party like the Social Democrats. How do you build an enduring connection with those voters? And so I was on the election study last night as well. I was given a quick look at it and asking people, you know, why do you vote for this political party and why do you not vote for another political party? And one of the questions we ask is about partisanship. And one of the challenges for parties in the soft left space is when we ask them, do you always vote for this party? Most of them answer no. In fact, the number in the survey was 0. So there aren't enduring partisan connections. Yeah, but that's your challenge, though. Yeah. You have the voters now, but how do you keep them? And in fact, actually, this is the big challenge for Sinn Féin as well. Sinn Féin have really huge polling numbers kind of in the inter-election period, but they really struggle to keep those voters. So voters are coming to the parties because they're attracted by a particular collection of policies or the leader or the candidate in their area, but they're fluid and they're not staying with the parties on a consistent way. And to build, you have to have that consistent base of partisans, people who are going to vote for you every single election. And that's the challenge of politics the world over now. That partisanship isn't there anymore.
Is that a contrast between the understanding of somebody who kind of studies and observes politics and looks for trends, whereas I suppose for me and anyone else in the room who's knocked at doors, we're almost asking voters to loan their vote. There's no, and like we'll work to earn it and keep it back.
Well, it's very hard for a new party to have a loyal core base, right? I mean, Labour will have a core kind of 5% base, you could say. That's the kind of older centre-left leaning vote. You know, Fianna Fáil will have a core base, Sinn Féin have a core base, Fine Gael have a core base. Maybe that core base between those parties doesn't go beyond 10%, but it's still a kind of iron base, you know? For the Soc Dems, obviously, because you're a new party, you're only 10 years old, you don't really have that base. So I think it is true that is a challenge for the Social Democrats to build that loyalty, and it will become the biggest challenge if and when you enter government. Because if you enter government, you can pretty sure you're going to lose a lot of votes very quickly. And whereas other parties might shed votes and they still have their core, the risk, of course, for the Social Democrats is you shed your votes and you shed all your votes. But what I would say, though, I mean, what is working in the Social Democrats' favour, right? So education is the key variable here. I mean, what has changed in Ireland over the past 20, 30, 40 years? We have a remarkably high percentage of our voters with university and higher levels of education, much higher than most other kind of capitalist democracies. And if you want to learn anything from the literature and political science, the core base today of any centre-left party, right, is higher educated, low to middle income. And whereas 20 or 30 years ago, the amount of voters that had university education but were on low to middle income was about 5% of the vote. But jump forward to the present, there's a lot of voters, it's up to 25, in the Irish case nearly 30% of voters who have university higher levels of education but are on relatively low to middle incomes. That's the core base for the centre left. And if you're looking at the Irish demographic base, you're looking at Irish demographic changes, that kind of works in the favour of all social democratic centre-left parties in Ireland. And I think, by the way, that's why most centre-right parties, nominally speaking, shift towards the centre-left as well on policy, because they know that's where the median voter is.
Gary, do you...
Well, my colleagues were working on the election study last night. This morning I was in the bar, so
Let's take it to real
maybe what I have to say won't be as profound. But I just like to push back on this idea that if you go into government, you're automatically then doomed at the next election. Yeah, I mentioned already the Progressive Democrats and the Greens and Labour, but Fianna Fáil were nearly re-elected with an overall majority in 2002. When the famous lots done, more to do, and the economy was booming. If you and we can sort of talk about whether that was a good thing or not, because of course we had the crash only a half decade away. But if you can get into government and make things happy and satisfy not your core voters but floating voters, and as my colleague said, the majority is that floating. But if you can get things done in government and then say we got this done, vote us back in and we'll get more things done.
Gary, can we challenge an assumption just a little bit in terms of the Social Democrats' reluctance for government? Let's even just do a poll around the room. Who here feels the Social Democrats should be in government at the next election?
Oh yeah, at the bar everyone told me this last night. Everyone told me this, well hold on, everyone told me this last night as well. Of course I want, and I had a big talk.
But can I ask another question? Put your hands up if you think you should be in government with Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael.
And we're going to get to this.
Well,
But we are going to get to
exactly
this.
it.
No, I had that poll ready.
No, you took the words out of my mouth, Aidan, exactly it. I mean, but if you have to go into government, you're going to have to go in with somebody who has a different sort of perspective, might be much longer in the game, almost certainly be longer in the game, and you're going to have to compromise on some things, unquestionably. And it's that compromise, and if you say, no, we can't compromise, and if you say, look, we're not compromising on tax cuts or whatever the case may be, and then you say, look, we tried our best, but we couldn't go into government, which I understand is the narrative from 2024. I mean,
But the
at
implication-
some stage, I think you have to say, look, we have to bite the bullet.
But the implication of what you're saying, Gary, is that the Soc Dems should go into government with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, because the way things work at the moment in Irish politics, Fianna Fáil can't be in government without Fine Gael, and Fine Gael can't be in government without Fianna Fáil. So they have to govern together, and then the question is who basically props them up? And I suppose the challenge for the Social Democrats is, are we going to step into the fold to keep Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael in government again?
No, but
I would suspect the Soc Dem base would say, hell no.
Yeah.
You know?
No, but my theory is that you don't have to accept those numbers. If Fianna Fáil can go from 76 seats to 20 seats in one election and drop from 42% to 17% in that election. Now, granted, that was the crash election, but the volatility is such that I think you can see larger swings than we've potentially seen.
Yeah, I think the question will be a different combination, though. The question will be Fianna Fáil, Sinn Féin, and who else? To some extent, I mean, I think Fine Gael are going to be on the margins the next time around. So the question will be Fianna Fáil, Sinn Féin, and the Social Democrats. And that's probably what you'll actually be voting at in a conference, something like this. You know, Fianna Fáil is a great chameleon of Irish politics. It'll swing to the left if needs be, if that's what's required to stay in government. I think the more interesting questions will be around governing with Sinn Féin, which is a very different kind of political party, and very different in terms of its experiences in government. And so I think, you know, thinking about it in terms of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael is really thinking through the old lens. You have these different blocks, and it will be different combinations of those blocks. The thing is, you need 3 blocks. Or at least some big chunk of the kind of miscellaneous block. And I'm sorry to call them miscellaneous, but it really does. But there are left-wing, by the way, independents in there as well. So, you know, I wouldn't assume they're all right-wing ethno-nationalists. Some of them are left-wing independents, so there's potential support that you could pull out of that. But even that in and of itself, though, is inherently difficult to govern with, because you're governing with collections of independents. And to go back to what Gary was saying, that's a difficult thing to do, you know. So the choice is very unlikely to be Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Social Democrats. Actually, I think it'll be something a good deal more complicated than that.
I imagine so. I often see the tension in the perception of the Social Democrats is almost, what is their purpose in Irish politics? And Gary, I kind of get the sense, and maybe put more to you, it's almost like we should be the progressive Democrats almost of the left, where we're pulling politics to the left. And the leftist Democrats had that role, whereas Aidan, I kind of see you as seeing us as somewhere where almost like we're leading, or part of a leading of a left looking to take full control of government. Is that the tension that...
I'm not sure I mean, I think you're right. I think the reason I say it like that is that the demographic changes in Irish politics work very much in the favour of any kind of centre-left party. But I think it's better to think about it in terms of blocks. If we learn anything from the rest of Europe, let's say, it's not necessarily that there's 5 blocks, there's kind of 3 blocks. You've got a liberal centre-right block, you've got a centre-left block, and you've got a far-right block. And let's be real, there will be a far-right block in Irish politics. It's only a matter of time. So I would say, I suspect that Irish politics will solidify around those 3 blocks. And I agree, it's never going to be possible to govern alone. So who do you govern with? That's the nature of politics, and that's the nature of the campaign. So the question, I think, is, I don't imagine, being honest, that the Social Democrats could lead a government, if I'm being honest, not in the medium to short-term future. I do think the question is, can you build and grow to offer an alternative government with Sinn Féin? And then it becomes the question, is there enough support, broadly speaking? Because if the Social Democrats solidify themselves as the main centre-left bloc, let's say, with Sinn Féin, and they get to 15, 16, 18% in the polls, well, then you've got serious bargaining power, obviously. But that is kind of hypothetical into the future. But I do think the question is, can you offer an alternative government to Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael?
Yeah, I would agree with that about an alternative government, but I'm not remotely convinced there's a far-right bloc looming and going to make a big impact over the course of the next half-decade or decade. Like, where's the evidence for that? I mean, people talk about, what's his name in Dublin Central, Malachy Steenson. I remember when he was in the Workers' Party, for God's sake. I mean, like, there have been far-right candidates. They tried to get elected. There was a few council seats, and then, you know, when it came to the big elections, general election in particular, you know, they have 2.6% of the vote, something like that. Yeah, of course, everyone, that's a worry, and it could grow. But I Theresa will give out to me for this, but I do think Ireland is a little bit different to the rest of Europe, and Aidan will give out to me. I mean, I do think there is. I think there's evidence to suggest that. So I'm not like and Aidan, you wrote a very good paper a few years ago with Stephen Muller talking about how the Irish voter was going left.
Oh, the median voter definitely in Irish.
Theresa, we're going to Theresa in for
20% of voters have what I'm sure the Social Democrats would consider to be quite undesirable views, and it depends what you measure. A lot of kind of comparative European studies have actually put Ireland really low down in terms of what we call anti-outgroup attitudes. But actually, when we measure them as Irish political scientists, the number is much higher because we put travellers in and we explicitly call that out. And actually, when you do that, you find that there's about 1/5 of the electorate that have really hostile views to minorities, to gender equality, they're really strong anti-outgroup attitudes. Now, one of the things that we've been looking at for several years is how come that group haven't connected electorally with a particular political party? And there are lots of reasons for that. For quite a period of time, the people who hold those attitudes, by the way, they also tend to have very strong anti-elite sentiment. Yeah. They really don't like the establishment, they're hostile to politicians. And so for a long time, actually, Sinn Féin was able to attract some of those voters because they were much stronger on the anti-establishment thing. They vote also for independence, and now they vote for some of the kind of smaller, fragmented far-right parties. But, the conversation that we're having here about the centre-left, a very similar but much more splintered and fragmented conversation is happening in the far-right. There isn't a policy entrepreneur, there isn't a party that's been able to break through and capture those voters, but they are there.
But here's where I genuinely have a fear when it comes to the far-right, because I don't think there's any charisma in any of the far-right to actually capture or galvanise, and we think we've been very lucky in that regard. But I do feel the far-right don't necessarily win when they win elections. I think the far-right win when they get nice middle-class centrists to steal their clothes. And for me, when you see some of the policy initiatives that's being brought forward by Fianna Fáil and Jim McCallum in particular, the refugee reunification scheme, family reunification scheme, targeted at 697 people last year, that's where I start to feel a little bit fear of the rhetoric and the policies moving into the centre.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. I mean, there was a lot of talk already in the first 20 minutes or so about the centre-left and sort of the ideology of Ireland. But I mean, most people are voting for normal bread and butter issues, whether that's housing or the health services or immigration, perhaps, is maybe what we should be concentrating on. And political parties do sometimes just follow that sort of that trend, and I think unquestionably, if you look at the change in rhetoric in Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael on immigration, you see that. Sometimes you just have to stick to your principles, which I think is an important point. And what does this party stand for? It has to stand for some principles, which it does. And I think that's one of the issues or one of the things you should be very proud of. And if that means, going back to my other earlier point, no government, well then, so be it.
No, I think it's what's interesting. I mean, I would agree, obviously, that at the moment, in terms of the supply side of politics, there's no party or political entrepreneur who is successful enough to mobilise that part of the vote. But I do think it's only a matter of time, because you can't have 20% of voters now consistently identifying immigration, for example, as the key issue that concerns them, and have no responsiveness from the political system to it. Maybe the kind of liberal centre-right parties will begin to respond. Maybe Sinn Féin will have to respond. And I think this is going to be the challenge for the Social Democrats. Given the voter base of Sinn Féin, given the kind of working class base, quite frankly, that they have, the Social Democrats are going to have to give Sinn Féin a little bit of rope, quite frankly, to be a little bit more responsive to that issue than you're going to be because of your different base. That's going to be a real challenge, I think, for the Social Democrats as a party. That's one thing. But the other thing as well, let's not forget about Aintu, right? Aintu have a pretty core base there too. I mean, I could see Aintu growing to 10, 12% of the vote quite easily, to be honest, if they really focus on that issue. But it is also worth keeping in mind, in terms of policies at the moment at least, they're pretty to the left on the economy, right? They've got pretty left-wing economic views. So a challenge for the Social Democrats, for Sinn Féin, for Labour, for the Greens, People Before Profit, although I don't think People Before Profit would ever go into government, so we can probably exclude that. But more, in that kind of block, let's say, could you also govern with Aintu, for example, and reach a common platform around economic policy?
Do the poll again?
because and if not, well then that's obviously going to be a key.
Intu's more out than Fianna Fáil.
And I suspect the answer is no. But then in response to that means Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, if Aintu grow as a party, that could be their core interlocutor to govern for another.
But I must, you're talking about Aintu getting to 10%. Earlier on, you talked about the far right maybe being 20%. That's a third of the vote.
So 20% of voters who hold far right view.
Well, whether they'll vote then, but I just like Aintu have 2 seats. One of them they were haunted to get. Let's use a cock phrase, absolutely haunted, because of some weird transfer thing up in Mayo that I don't.
I don't want to do Brendan O'Connor again, but if they're not here to defend themselves.
Didn't quite understand. I was asked a question about the Mayo transfers on RTE on the night, and I kind of blustered something completely pointless about. I think these are the boxes from Ackle or something. It was, but no,
Are we lucky in that regard? Are we lucky though, in the sense that there isn't much charisma in that side of defence?
We're lucky that the government has loads of money to throw at the problem.
Yeah. Luck isn't a policy, though. That's why we're in the situation we're in. We're lucky because the people in that space are pretty odious. And actually, the research from 2024 tells us that was there quite a few people, quite a few voters, about 20% of voters in that space, actually the candidates and the parties are more extreme. They're more extreme than where the voters are, and the voters aren't quite willing to go as far as what the parties are offering. Actually, where the real challenge will come is if somebody comes into that space that pulls them back from really, really extreme opinions on immigration, on race, on equality, and moves them a bit closer to the centre, and then they become really more capable of actually attracting those voters with the kind of outgroup right-wing votes.
I would not underestimate the importance. Again, because we're in Ireland, we have a tendency to just look at Ireland. It's worth stepping outside of Ireland, looking in from abroad, right? Ireland is extremely unusual in that the government is awash with money and is awash with cash, which means that they can just throw cash at the welfare state and basically put a lid on so many different problems. As soon as that money is not there, you'd have to be pretty naive to think that that's not going to go in a very nasty direction.
I mean, why is the government awash with cash? One could argue that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have been prudent with the finances. You could argue this, I'm working on something around the crash at the moment, and a major personality of the crash, and I remember. Most of us here will about this was the end of Ireland as we know it, and the country was doomed, and the Troika were here and we'd never get rid of them. They were gone within 3 years. Politics has certainly changed. I think I have a bit more faith in the sort of the centre and its potential to grow and to combat the extremes of the far right and the far left. I mean, I agree with Aidan completely. It'll be a cold day in hell before Paul Murphy ever goes into government. Whatever about Holly and compromising on something in Gary, I mean, God, no, that's not going to happen. And I'm very happy.
He doesn't know me now, a compromising person.
I'm very happy to see Richard Boyd Barrett, who I've known for a long time, back in the Dáil and over his health scare. But Richard isn't going to go into government.
Gary, I love the fact that you were talking about how they Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael have been quite prudent with the finances, and then segued into, I've been working on a study about the crash.
I'll give you a signed copy of my book when it comes out.
I think we can open up the questions shortly, and before we do, I might just ask, there's one for
It's
question.
from the bar, I need to get some water from last night.
That was very rude of me, sorry. The Social Democrats, we had a set here where it was 10 years ago. We would have been on a very low percentage in polls, and we wouldn't have as many people in the room or as many TDs or councillors.
Oh, thanks.
What have we done well? What do we need to be cautious about in order to continue or preserve our growth? What would you advise us if you are looking from the outside, as many do us?
I mean, I think in some respects, the first thing to say is it's actually really difficult to set up a party in Ireland now. And actually, one of the things that we didn't realise, again, I've been around a long time too, you go back and why did we had all of these corruption scandals, and then we brought in all of these rules about money in politics, and the unintended consequence of that was that it actually became extremely difficult to set up political parties because you couldn't get funding, and the kind of amounts that you can get are really relatively low and not sufficient actually to build political political parties. So the first thing to say is the very fact that you're here 10 years on, like I was brought in for something very similar about 10 years ago when you were meeting in Cork. The fact that you're still here 10 years on, that you have a national organisation, that's actually a really considerable achievement, because everything was against you, including the laws that are actually there around political parties. In fact, it's near impossible to set up a party now unless you already have TDs and the Dáil, and they have that funding. So that what you've done is pretty impressive, and that you're still here. Your biggest challenge, I guess, is growing that connection with voters over a longer period of time, building a base of partisans, small perhaps to start with, but you have to build that core support base, people who will stay with the party through thick and thin. And I think that's your really big challenge into the future.
Aidan, how do we manage the tension between the pull of the left and the pull of the more centre-left as we hopefully continue that progression?
I think the political science, we would call this the issue space, right? What are the key issues that you can focus on that other parties are not focusing on? And I think the Soc Dems were really clever in that regard in the election. For example, childcare, disability issues, really, you've picked certain issues and focused on those. Housing is obviously the big issue in Ireland. But I think this is where I think it gets, given that the government is awash with cash, and it's mainly awash with cash because of a windfall amount of money from a handful of US multinationals, that obviously gives the government a lot of space to buy off voters. And you'd have to assume that that money's not going to be around forever. But I think what a lot of voters, in terms of that centre-left, or if you wanted to pull in that direction, people want the government to get shit done, right? And that's not happening. And I think there's a large cohort of voters who are just fed up, and they perceive the state as ineffective, not delivering, not performing, not delivering public services. So where I think the Soc Dems can really distinguish themselves, let's say from Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, is that we actually believe in the state. We actually believe in the state delivering these things, and here's how we're going to deliver. We recognise that in order to have better public services, you have to employ more people, right? You have to invest in your universities, you have to invest in your schools, and most of the time that means more people working. But on top of that, we're going to also clean out a lot of crap, and we're going to do serious public sector reform, right? Where you're dragging in voters of the centre right, let's say, who know that the state is quite inefficient in lots of parts of public service, and we're going to reform that. So it seems to me an effective state and delivering on the effective state is a winning formula for the Soc Dems.
Yeah.
I would add, one of the worrying things about Irish politics is the declining turnout. Under 60% for the first time now ever at the November 2024 election, and that's no good for anybody, it seems to me. But there is an opportunity, I think, in enticing voters back in. I don't think it's a case of buying them off. A lot of this is their own money anyway, coming back from tax. But it's, I do think that is a worry, and I am heartened when I see people like yourself, Gary, and Sinead, and Holly, and Rory, and others getting involved in politics and saying this politics is worthwhile. It's worthy to do it. It's worthy to get up, go out, knock on doors, say vote for us because these are our policies, these are what we believe, and this is what we believe, and we think we can have a better country for our children and grandchildren, and that's how I see it.
Thank you.
Questions? Mr. Optimism here.
Bit of optimism. We're not a bad group of lads. Okay, is there a roving mic, or how are we doing this? Yes, we have a roving mic, thank you.
Don't give out to me.
So guys, we're going to do so as we ask a question, we're going to just do 30 seconds and finish it with a question mark, if that's okay. Agreed? Yeah, excellent.
Yeah, no speeches.
Yeah, because we started with a question mark, so we'll continue that.
I don't need 30 seconds, I think. Dave McCarthy, Cork South Central. Canvassing in that area, not to be political about it, say in the comfortable classes, I was struck by how many people who were adamantly Fianna Fáil, adamantly Fine Gael. We don't want to know about Social Democrats, but were open to the message of decency. I believe those two parties, which are rich in constituents, can be enticed into thinking, well, how decent are you as a person when your government has failed again and again to do anything about house prices or rent prices? I think we can market a voting campaign, or do you think it's possible to market a voting campaign aimed at stealing those voters?
Okay, so the question there was, do you think you can have a campaign based on decency that steals the traditional...
You got Pádraig Race elected in Cork South Central, didn't you?
There you go.
It was against the odds, completely against the odds. I gave him no chance, needless to say. So, you know, what do I know?
Do sometimes political analysts miss kind of waves that are yet to be understood? And that's not just not.
Exactly.
I sometimes think, because I know you said like somebody like Porrick wasn't seen, but I don't know, anyone that's in this room would probably have felt that before it happened. It's question.
Well, can I answer that question?
Answer that question, yeah.
I mean, in response to that question, I think there is a gap in politics at the moment where a lot of people feel that the values have just plummeted. And, you know, you see that obviously in the UK at the moment with the Epstein files, etc. There's just a serious distrust in politics. And this idea that politicians are just in it for themselves, that the public sector doesn't deliver. So, and they're on the take. I do think there's a space for political party, for politicians to say, no, actually, we really do believe in the public interest. We actually do believe in the public good. And we actually are acting in the public interest and the public good. I think that resonates with voters, absolutely. And I think it is part of the kind of populist wave that people just think all of these elites are in it for themselves.
And I just add to that the most perilous thing we do is predict who's going to get the 5th seat in multi-seat constituencies.
If you bring I see Cat O'Driscoll over there, if you wouldn't mind allow me to pass it over to my own constituency. Well, this Cork.
Yes, I'm a Cork woman who sits on Dublin City Council.
There you go now.
I'm just trying to change the kind of angle that we're looking at. Is there much discussion about changing the franchise? There are people who don't have an Irish or British passport that can't vote in Dáil elections. And the impact of the decisions made in the Dáil directly impacts their day-to-day, whether it is disability, childcare, etc. But local elections, where people, and we knock on doors so often, and people say, we can't vote, and I'm looking for their vote, and I'm saying, yeah, absolutely you can, here's how you register. There hasn't been a look at the franchise in decades. Is that something that we should be looking at in such a multicultural country?
A look at the franchise.
The thing with the franchise is a lot of our rules are written into the Constitution. And so making serious changes would actually require constitutional referendums. That's not something that's really part of the conversation at the moment. In terms of where the conversation is at, it's talking about maybe reducing or lowering the voting age to 16. And the other part of the kind of reform conversation is whether Irish people, Irish passport holders living abroad should be enfranchised to vote at presidential elections. So that's where the conversation is at. We're not unusual in not enfranchising people who aren't citizens. Actually, we're already a little bit unusual in giving the franchise to British people living in Ireland. That's a reciprocal arrangement. It works in both directions. And of course, we can all understand the historical reasons why it's there. But as a general rule, in relation to general elections and local elections, we're considered to have reasonably expansive regulations. And that's not even part of the conversation. And I should probably also say the 2 referendums that will be required either for 16, voting at 16, or the presidential elections, I mean, they're highly likely to fail, and fail in large numbers, because that's also a lesson of about the last 20 years. Technical political reforms are really hard to pass in referendums. You know, people aren't that interested in them. They only engage at the last minute. The campaigns are hard to do. And whilst the ideas might be interesting and broadly positive, it is just really difficult to get those referendums passed.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, yourself with the microphone?
Yeah, hi, this is more directed for Theresa, but you spent a lot of the panel talking about how Irish politics has become block-based. I was wondering, do you think it mirrors, I suppose, the Dutch colour block system? And they've just elected a minority government there, and do you think, how should the Soc Dems navigate potential minority governments here in Ireland in the future?
I mean, I think it broadly mirrors the structures that we've seen in a lot of West European countries for years. They've grown into pillars, and those are ideological pillars. It's more complex in some of our European neighbours because it's broken by confessional structures as well, but we're seeing kind of those similar things happening. Minority government is something that, you know, there was a lot of discussion when we had the minority government that was formed, that you know, it would collapse, that we wouldn't be able to manage it. Politics adapts to the circumstances that are before it. It takes longer to form governments, but mechanisms can be changed. The Dáil was reformed. Some of those reforms have been lost now, actually, because you have a majority government that came in and said, oh, we're not having any more of that. The Dáil system and the political system itself is nothing but adaptable, and it can be altered to support those types of coalitions. But the thing about those countries, though, is consensus and coalition building is a deep feature of their politics, and it has been for a very long time. And it goes back to your polling questions at the start. A lot of it is about who are you willing to coalesce with, who are you not willing to coalesce with, and building out that space so you get more viable coalitions.
Going to continue this jukebox round and move over to this way, but Lydia, and then we'll move back over this way and then come back over.
As a mic,
sorry.
yeah.
Oh, you have the microphone. Oh no, after, yeah, you'll be next.
Lydia Bigley, Dunleary branch. So I just have a general question for the panel. I was wondering, so let's take a scenario where in the next general election, Soc Dems, of course, do really well, and we have the opportunity to go in with either Fianna Fáil, I can't bear to say this for Gael, or Sinn Féin. How do you think that would look in terms of, let's say it was one of each of those parties, so we went in with one of those three parties, what would you think would be the challenges, the benefits, and particularly in the case of Sinn Féin, having a government where all the parties in it have never been in government before?
Would that be, that's an interesting question.
Well, yeah, I mean sorry.
Aidan, if you want to go first.
Sure, I mean, I think the question is, what is the challenge? Is that really what you're saying? I think you could overcome some of those challenges if you had some sort of common platform with other parties of the broad left on key policy issues in advance of the election. That voters know that when they go to the polls that they're voting for either the present government or an alternative government. And you don't have to get into detail on what exactly those policy issues are. You're just signalling very clearly to voters, these are our core issues. Then when it comes down to the hard politics of bargaining, seat distribution, or cabinet distribution, etc., and you get into governing, well, that's when it becomes difficult. And I would suspect on issues like immigration, other social issues, there might be some tension. But if you have core policy issues focused on housing, focusing on public services, you can probably plaster over those. However, having said that, if the numbers don't add up, obviously, after the election, then it's all bets are off and you have to open up negotiations with everybody. But I do think having some sort of common-ish platform in advance of an election where you're signaling to voters, here are our core policy issues, here's what we will govern on, here's what we will prioritise, that would give you a lot of leverage to plaster over the inevitable tensions and cracks that would come in a government.
I wouldn't be too worried about government with neither Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, and in other words, a whole new set of parties who had never been in government before. You have a professional civil service to sort of guide parties through that. I think the danger for the Social Democrats going in with Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael is people would say, oh, it's just the same. It's a different third leg. It was the Greens, it was the Regional Independents, now it's the Social Democrats. What the hell is the change going on here? And that's why you do have to have that very sharp sort of differentiation between your policies and theirs if that is the government. I think that's the big danger. I mean, as I said, I would like to see the Social Democrats in power because I think that would say something and it would give you an opportunity to, you know, you've got a lot of energy over the course of the last 10 years, and my fear for political parties who don't go into government is that there are people who say, like, why would I vote for them? So they'll never go into government. But I think it would look, that's the danger, it would look the same.
Sure.
Mr. Ali Banji, Kerry branch. We've been talking a lot about where we could steal votes, but I actually think as a political party, and I don't say this with any malice, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are actually more aggressive than we are in trying to take the foreign vote, and the rest of the parties in Ireland actually lack that ambition to try and get that foreign vote. And don't we think it is a vote that's worthwhile courting? No. You heard me, right?
We hear you. Yeah.
I think it's a fair point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it matters which type of election you're talking about, and I mean, at local elections it's a very broad franchise, and so kind of what we might loosely call New Irish are much more likely to be enfranchised to vote and to be able to vote. For the European Parliament elections, obviously you've got all the EU citizens who are also enfranchised, but the vote gets narrower when you go up to the Dáil elections, and so, you know, parties have to be strategic. It's about, kind of as Gary's saying, you know, you have to be ruthless. You have to focus in on the people that can vote for you. So, you know, there's an element of that. It depends on the level of the election or the type of the election, I suppose.
But it's also, if I just add something, I don't know is the honest answer, but I mean, depends on what one means by the foreign vote, right? Presumably, you mean people who have the right to vote in the first place, so they're citizens, so basically New Irish who can vote. I think on that basis, parties will try to attract voters regardless of where they may be from or parents may be from originally. what's so consistent in the data from the electoral survey and previous electoral surveys as well, you know, self-identification on a left-right scale is an extremely powerful predictor of who you're going to vote for. On a scale of 1 to 10, if you identify more to the centre right, you're going to vote Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael. And if you're a little bit further to the right again, Aim 2, and further to the right again, well, the whole spectrum in between. If you self-identify on the left, you're either going to go for Sinn Féin, Labour, Soc Dems, Greens, People Before Profit, etc. So that self-identification variable is really powerful in predicting who you vote for. So it seems to me there really is actually a left-right divide in Irish politics. It's more complex, obviously, because most median voters kind of on key different issues will float. So it seems to me parties need to focus on mobilising who is going to vote for them, regardless of their background. And it seems to me that obvious left-right spectrum is where that battle is taking place. And if it is indeed the case, we don't know yet, but it will be interesting into the future, who do the new Irish actually self-identify with and who do they vote for? Maybe it's simply the case that they actually lean more to the centre-right.
Kieran?
Kieran Nevin, Dublin Central. I suppose this is a question I'd like all your views on, but it's in response to your comment, Gary, and I appreciate it was possibly throwaway, but in this notion that Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are fiscally responsible and, you know, are sort of managing things well, and like public spending now is about 125 billion. In nominal terms, it's up, it has doubled in 9 years. In real terms, probably up about 70%. There isn't 70% more services to show for it. And you'd really have to wonder, you know, who's making the decisions. You know, they're also talking about tax cuts. Economic rationale would say you do not cut taxes when an economy is at risk of overheating. You know, how is it that those two parties are able to hold that position as being seen as fiscally responsible when all the evidence suggests otherwise? And how do parties like us challenge that?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And it wasn't a throwaway remark, because simply Aidan said it, that the money is there. It's coming from somewhere. And one could argue, if it was at the Fianna Fáil Ardèche, God help me, if the Ardèche even, yeah, or Fine Gael, I'm sure they would say, look, we are the stewards of prudence, because, you know, the evidence is in the tax receipts and in the monies created within the state. Certainly, I mean, my mother, who lived here in Cork for years, well, all her life, was very sick at the end, and oh my God, navigating the bureaucracy of the health service. Once we were in, it was fine. When I had to move her to Dublin, when she just got too sick to live here on her own, yeah, the health services are creaking. Everyone knows that. The housing crisis. We're talking about a crisis because it is a crisis, and it's been a crisis for a decade or more. But the proof in terms of the scepticism of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael is in their collapsing vote. If we were here even a decade ago, just even after the crash, you'd be saying they're still at 70% or close to it, where now they're barely 40.
But it depends when you start counting. It depends when you start your point of analysis. I mean, where does their reputation for fiscal prudence come from? Well, if we were here 100 years ago and we were looking at today, we'd say, geez, how did that happen? Because we used to be an economic backwater on the fringes of Europe. Now we're one of the richest countries in the world. If you started looking at it in 2008, you would say, how could you lose such extraordinary riches and drive the economy into the wall? So, like, the question of fiscal prudence, it very much depends how you frame that question and what you mean by that question. I mean, I don't think anybody could really say what's happening at the present moment is fiscally prudent. In fact, there's every reason to believe that there are catastrophically ill-informed decisions being made. I would just add to that, though, of course, that Social Democrats would be even worse, because they would want to spend even more money, which is extremely ill-advised given the circumstances that we find ourselves in. So your version of fiscal prudence, I understand that's very upsetting. Your version of fiscal prudence really depends on what the question is and what the starting point for where you begin that, you know.
You would learn in the sense that we wouldn't promise tax cuts at the same time offering to invest in public services. But Aidan, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I don't think any political party in Dáil Éireann would be fiscally prudent when they have that level of windfall cash coming in from the multinational sector. I think the issue really is if that money dries up, what do you do in response? Because this is more closer to my own research, so I could go on all day about this and I won't. But when you have nearly a third of total revenue coming from your corporate tax sector, firstly, that's extremely unusual. Ireland is a complete outlier. And on top of that, when you realise that most of that is literally coming from the subsidiaries of 10 large multinational groups, more concretely about 5 of them, and then you look at labour income taxes and you realise actually it's highly concentrated in the top 10% of earners, most of whom actually work in that sector, we have a ridiculously overly concentrated tax base. That's the fundamental problem in Irish fiscal policy. I don't actually think the level of spending that has taken place is a problem because demographic changes, population growth, the austerity years, the bounce back. I actually think there's a strong case you made that you should be investing in public services and infrastructure, but you need to show value for money and you need to show very clearly how effective that is. And that's my point earlier on about delivery. Can you deliver those services with that level of money? And I think that's where the present government fall down.
But I'd be very careful before launching an electoral campaign on the back of more taxes for the lower paid. I mean, I just don't think it's going to really run, you know.
Take down the posters.
I mean,
take down the posters.
it's like it's a serious point. It's actually the solution. The tax base is far too narrow. But who is going to campaign on higher taxes?
Just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the SOC Dems go into the next election saying no more taxes for low to middle income earners, but it is a real structural problem facing the state, and I don't think any political party is really in a position to know what to do.
Okay, I have not given this side of the room a lot of love in terms of questions because I actually can't see who has their hands up or who doesn't. So if somebody has their hands up and just give them a microphone and stand up, then yes.
Hello, so Thomas Creamer, Dublin West. Gary mentioned before about the lower turnout in the 24 election. How much of that is down to the fact that people might have been a bit disillusioned, not thinking that there was an alternative to the current government? And how much could that be rectified by a joint left platform, which not only could help engage more people, but also avoid the challenge of the left eating each other's votes?
And can I ask how much of that is also down to the electoral register actually not being
the register's on
6%. Yeah, but
the register's a joke.
It's an absolute joke.
But no, it's a very good point because I think there is some strong evidence to suggest that if you don't see a full alternative between a change of government and the existing government, and you're not like the people in this room politically sort of interested to read, the blogs and the papers day in, day out, and it's raining on the Friday or the Saturday and, you want to watch football and whatever, you say, I won't bother voting. But if you look at Britain, though, where there is a clear choice, voting turnout there is going down, so I'm not sure it's just about government formation. But I do agree the idea that if you, and particularly being PRSTV and, when we're voting in these individual constituencies, I don't think it helped, certainly, when there wasn't that sort of clear dichotomy between you can re-elect the government or you can re-elect the opposition. Or elect the opposition.
I just had Aidan's colleague actually is the person who did the work on that, Thomas Dowbler at UCD, and he's done a fairly large study using CSO data from the actual population and mapping it across, and the estimate is there's somewhere between maybe 300 and 500,000 people on the register who shouldn't be on the register. So the figures are distorted. But the other thing is there are two big drivers of kind of why people vote. One is people think it's a duty or an obligation, and the other is that they're interested in politics. And actually across the population as a whole, both of those are falling. So less people think they have an obligation to vote, and less people are actually interested in politics.
But that's why I think it is an important question. Now, political scientists are good at kind of looking at the structural stuff, the demographic stuff, the trends, etc., and so on. What's often difficult to grasp, and you guys know far better than we do, is in the mobilization of a campaign. When you get a certain energy going, right? And I think that's what a kind of vote left, transfer left type campaign does. When you have a kind of bit of momentum and energy, people see, oh, do you know what? There is a real genuine alternative on offer here. It might be able to mobilize, not saying it's not going to mobilize everybody, but it will mobilize a sufficient cohort of voters to get out and to vote accordingly. And what's really interesting with Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael is just how disciplined their voters have become in terms of how they transfer. It's quite remarkable in a short space of time. It just kind of solidifies them as kind of one kind of block, one party almost. But so I think the question then, I agree, if there is a momentum, if there is a campaign, that energy, that force does actually give people a very strong incentive to get out and to vote in a certain way.
I'm going to stay off this side of the room. I can see a microphone in here. Yes.
Sandra.
Well done, Sandra.
Dublin West. Considering you were talking about the reliance we have on big corporations, and most of that's coming from the US. So I am wondering, considering let's bring Trump into the conversation. Well, how important is it, our interest on the changing role of the EU, how our European, getting European votes and how we're going to approach that, and how the triple lock situation, all of that is very topical, and should we consider that?
Okay. So, yeah, Theresa, you've...
No, I'll hand the multinationals and the
I mean,
global to you.
What more is
Aidan.
there to say on that other than Ireland has a very, very qualitatively unique economy, which is just not really replicable or comparable anywhere else, in that we're so structurally dependent on not just a handful of US multinationals, but in key sort of sectors. Take that away, and the Irish economy looks very, very, very different. And I think this kind of, like, Ireland is the only country in the world that has to develop a new indicator of national income in order to capture the variance between per capita income growth at GDP level and the actual real income available to people. There's no other country in the world that has a 200 billion gap between those two measures. So it's a really distorted economy. It completely distorts the national accounts, and in turn that distorts the narrative and the stories that politicians, policymakers, people in the media, analysts tell. Unless you really grasp that stuff, and I don't mean to be disrespectful to people in the media, they don't grasp that and they don't understand it.
Just one very quick point on the triple lock. If the government was Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Social Democrats, and the Social Democrats insisted the triple lock would stay, there'd be no discussion on the triple lock.
Okay, there you go.
That's why you should think of going into government.
Artem,
there would be no discussion. There'd be no discussion. Look at Mercosur. Of course not. If the Social Democrats are in government and say triple lock stays, pal, Micheál would say, of course, I'm a great believer in the triple lock.
Here you are now. Can we get a microphone over here? Artem flew in from Cyprus yesterday for the convention, so he's getting a question.
Yeah, so I'm a new Irish, but I'll ask an old Irish question. If we're talking about a seismic shift in like this 10 to 15 years perspective, how does the North play into that? Ooh. How does that change the outlook of these blocks and trends, in your opinion?
Sure.
Well, I think that's a very good question, because if the Social Democrats were in government with Sinn Féin, unquestionably Sinn Féin's whole raison d'etre remains Irish unity. That's the big question for them. I mean, Aidan talks about the working class base, and of course Sinn Féin have the working class base, but if we were at the Sinn Féin Ardèche, unity would be the total conversation will stop, or will start her at the bar everywhere. And that's different, I think, from most other political parties. Fianna Fáil claim, to have a great love for the Fort Greene field, but I've been happy to wash their hands of it a little bit. I think it's an important question in relation to things like even organisation. Should you think of organising up in Northern Ireland in advance of unity? Because I think most people think, I know you have Fintan and Sam here later on with their blockbusting bestseller about Irish unity. I think Irish unity is much more likely now than it was, and I'm still looking forward a couple of decades. So yeah, that's a very, very interesting point.
I think the difficulty with conversations about Irish unity is the destiny and final, decisions or critical decisions probably won't be made on the island. Actually, the thing that's moved us even into the space where we're talking about this is Brexit, which happened somewhere else. And kind of probably the single biggest thing that we're looking at right now is what happens if you have a Farage government in the UK. What happens if you've got English nationalists in power who, strangely, are the least likely to actually, retain the critical interest in Northern Ireland. So the difficulty for us here is that we're almost always policy takers or events takers in relation to Northern Ireland. The critical decisions are often outside of our control, and we end up having to react and respond. So in terms of what we should do, we should be preparing, but preparing in a gentle way, because we also don't want to engage in preparations that ultimately end up exacerbating or inflaming what are already very delicate balances in Northern Ireland.
Yeah. Aidan, can I ask you just take a minute to answer that, because then I'm going to have to finish up with that.
Sure, I won't add anything other than to say that Fianna Fáil, Sinn Féin in particular, maybe Fianna Fáil more in the past, understood the importance of nationalism, patriotism and waving the flag for voters, and it does matter a lot to people. It doesn't matter a whole lot to centre-left parties in any particular country, and much political science would suggest to their detriment.
Okay. We only have 2 minutes left on the clock in front of me that is ticking. So if it's okay, I might just actually allow everybody to just give a round of applause, because that was a really great session. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
That was good old crack.
It doesn't have to go on for 2 minutes, you're fine. No, but really, we had an hour and 15 minutes there, and it actually flew past, and that's a testament to the knowledge that you brought to the subject. So really, Gary, Theresa,
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gary.
It's good.
Thank you.